4 years have passed since that amazing pairing of the Fifth and the Sixth Symphonies. And you could say, well, this is a fallow period in Beethoven's symphonic output. Maybe, but in terms of his other creativity, it's amazing what's going on. 1809, I mean, you've got already the Archduke Trio, you've got the beginnings of the Emperor Concerto, you've got the wonderful harp quartet, you've got Les Adieux, the piano sonata. Everything seems to be positive, but it's not really in his personal life. And this is, we come back to this time and time again, that there's a discrepancy, there's a disjunct between the events of his personal life and his creativity. He is finding life increasingly difficult, and he's saying, look, I am no Hercules, I'm not Atlas, I can't prop up the whole world, that's not what I'm here to do. And his situation in Vienna is getting worse. You've now got the Napoleonic armies invading the place, and there he is cowering in his brother's cellar and covering his ears with a pillow because he finds the bombardment so painful. In the following year, 1810, again a year of creativity. I mean, he's now addressing Goethe's wonderful drama Egmont with superb incidental music. And he's starting the Seventh and Eighth Symphonies. He's starting already to elaborate how they're going to be. I mean, the opening is imposing, and then these beautiful and very pure A major scales, which seem to have a sense of almost excitement at what's to come, but also a purity and a joy. All this imposing, grandiloquent music, he then narrows the focus of the whole orchestra and brings it right down in a kind of minimalist way to just an etiolated dialogue between flute and oboe on the one hand and the violins and octave on the other. And it's just a fragment of a tiny little rhythmic phrase exchanged with gaps, with silences. And you know something extraordinary is about to happen. And then we're off. There you have them whooping horns, and they're absolutely gambling and careering around the room. I mean, listening to this first movement, you can see exactly why Richard Wagner might have called this symphony the apotheosis of a dance, because there is so much sense of movement, of choreographic movement, even though we don't know exactly what it was. But it's not exactly courtly dance. He makes references to a kind of courtly gigue, and you can feel that it's almost in polite society, but no sooner has he suggested or sketched that out, that he just erupts. He brings in, as it were, a whole gang of hooligans, the scallywags, who come and invade the space where this concert is going on. And it must have shocked the audience at the time. While it's true that there is a kind of relentless, inexorable dance momentum to this movement, it gets occasionally overclouded by something quite different. I mean, for example, in the coda of this first movement, he just reduces the harmonic movement, it makes it almost static. But below these held E's in the winds and the violins, there's a kind of subterranean rumbling going on in the bass line. he's subverting our expectations because we think that's going to be the end of the symphony, but it's not. He actually manages to bridge it back into an explosive conclusion with the whole orchestra actually at full tilt. After all the euphoria of that first movement, the second movement, which you'd expect a slow movement, but it's not. It's an allegretto, not a adagio and andante. Comes as a hell of a surprise. I mean, first of all, you have a hell chord in the winds, and it feels as though Beethoven has thrown a stone into a beautiful lake, a completely calm pond, and you just see the concentric circles of the ripples going outwards. And then, as it were from nowhere, you hear this dactylic rhythm in the lower strings. And you wonder what's really going on here, because it has a sense of ritual, it has a sense of grandeur and a sense of movement, of a walking pace, not a hurried one at all. And it could be associated with a religious ritual. I mean, the words are suggestive of Sancta Maria, ora pro nobis. And that's something that Berlioz, when he heard Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, picked up on and virtually stole the idea for the second movement of his Second Symphony, Harold in Italy, for the Pilgrim's March. And there he's describing the rogation tide ceremony when the priest comes with the local church choir into the fields and blesses the crops, the growing crops, the vines, ahead of the harvest to come. It's a kind of daydream in Beethoven's mind. There he could be, as Berlioz did, sitting in the fields and contemplating and reading Shakespeare, reading Schiller, any of his great heroes. Other possibility, which has more kind of political, topical relevance, is that it could well be linked to the war victims, the war wounded Austrian troops, recovering after the Battle of Hainaut in May 1813. This concert, which was a benefit concert for the wounded troops, was in December of that year. And Beethoven writes that he felt there was a big debt of gratitude owed to the sacrifice made by these men. It's only when you get to the scherzo, the third movement of this symphony, that you realise quite how satisfying the proportions are between the four movements. I mean, there have been moments in the earlier symphonies when you think this movement is slightly too big in relation to the other three movements, but the proportions of these four movements seem to me absolutely ideal. And this scherzo, which is the longest scherzo up to this point, is just a wild dance. I mean, it is just so full of zest and energy. It's preposterous. The construction of this movement I find very interesting. I mean, it's in 5 different segments and they alternate. You have a presto section, which is the scherzo proper. Then you have a trio section, which he marks assai meno presto, which all it means is just a bit slower, but the mood is totally different. So scherzo, trio, scherzo. But what he does within that group is to subvert your expectations, partly because of the repeats, and partly because of these extraordinary juxtapositions of mood. The biggest tease comes at the very end, because when you think, well, we've heard the scherzo, we've heard the trio, we've heard the scherzo, we've heard the trio, he can't be doing it again, and he's saying, this music is too good to lose, I'm going to do it again. But he doesn't quite, he just does it in a 4-bar phrase, starting the trio, 2 bars in the major, 2 bars in the minor, and then 5 wham bang wallop chords from the orchestra, and it's all over. How do you follow that? I mean, you'd think that all the energy that he expends in the scherzo would just dissipate in the finale. Not so. He ratchets up the tempo, the intensity, the volume. It's, of course, a furious dance, and it's totally out of keeping with Biedermeier Vienna, with Jane Austen, with Polite Manners. This is pointing towards the Rite of Spring of Stravinsky. And actually, its origin is probably a piece that he set for the composer and editor George Thompson, an Irish reel, almost note for note, that he'd set a couple of years before. But in this context, when it's not chamber music at all, it's the full orchestra, you realise quite what giant steps Beethoven has made in the course of now his 7th symphony in terms of mastery of his orchestral apparatus, an apparatus that he can't really hear, he can't control. I mean, when he tried to conduct this piece, Louis Spohr, who was playing in the first violin, said it was pathetic to watch him actually try and direct the music, because he had no clue when it was beginning or when it was going to end. But for us, for our benefit, we've got this dynamo of energy, and it feels like being caught up in a tornado, this movement. You can hear the champagne corks bursting out here, can't you? And you sense really that the Congress of Vienna is not very far off. I mean, this is Vienna coming out of lockdown, of the tremendous sense of relief, after the years of misery. And it's all there in the music, and just the energy. It may not be refined in terms of its loudness, in terms of its energy, but it's certainly refined in the way that he constructs the orchestral palette of colours. And you wonder if it's not linked in some way to his idea at this time of writing an opera on the subject of Bacchus. We have sketches for it, and the sketches are actually integrated in the 7th Symphony. And he actually says at one moment, I am Bacchus, incarnate. He says, appointed to give humanity wine to drown its sorrows. He who divines the secrets of my music is delivered from the misery that haunts the world. Well, this certainly does. performing it in New York of all places, you get the sense of the energy, the hyper energy of that city. My gosh, how we all miss it.